And we're live on YouTube, and I think that's it, all around the world. Here's this Agile thing. My name's Matt Beam.
I'm Mike Markey.
And I'm Jeff Singleton.
And I'm Steve Periera.
Excellent. Welcome, Steve.
Glad
You're
to
the
be
guest. Yeah, awesome. You're the guest this week to talk about your new book. You've got a couple of books on flow, and so we were super curious to talk about that and get your view on what that is, especially in the context of whatever's happening with Agile nowadays, and why flow might be the new. My personal hypothesis is that flow might be the thing to focus on. I'm guessing you might agree. That's a bit of a broad statement. We can get into it. Anyway,
I wouldn't put what his thoughts are in his head. Let him tell us what his thoughts are.
that is the purpose of Steve joining. Yes. Steve, before we get into the book, would you like to just give us sort of an introduction to yourself, your background, how you got here, etc.?
Yeah. Well, I've always been in tech, but professionally for over 20 years now, probably coming up on 25. And I started very humbly in tech support. So always kind of very sensitive to customer needs. And that was my starting point, and how difficult it was to deal with technology from a business perspective. I was fixing printer problems and, Active Directory problems and all these friction points that folks dealt with in a business context, just trying to do their job. And I think that kind of, that very much set the foundation for my career. And I've been sensitive to that ever since, like this, how hard it is to do everything and how disconnected the technical details are from the kind of customer experience of everything that gets built. And I don't think I've always been aware of that, but that, in retrospect is kind of a common thread. And I went through build and release engineering, systems engineering, cloud engineering, always kind of focused on the delivery process and how to automate things, how to look for waste, how to optimize flow, minimize handoffs. I was a build and release engineer for quite some time, basically running around trying to get things in place so that we could release software. And then as a CTO, I kind of really hit major pain points that involved multiple stakeholders and external parties and trying to coordinate everything it takes to get stuff into the world. And that's where I kind of stumbled into value stream mapping without knowing it. And in the lean world of like, how do we accelerate this? And it was a combination of looking at everything end to end, measuring performance, trying to find the bottlenecks, trying to find the one constraint that could kind of elevate the performance dramatically, and just seeing like incredible results. And that kind of set me on a new course of like, so few people really talk about this and leverage these techniques. We all know that we all kind of know about them, but it's hard for us to step away from the work to work on the work, right? To work on how the work works. And so I've kind of focused on that because it's a passion of mine, but it's also, I think, an underserved niche. So to me, that was an opportunity, and I've really enjoyed learning more about it from an academic perspective. Why does this work, and where does it come from, and what are the things that I don't know that could enhance what I do know? And I've been kind of a student of lean and flow as a result, and then how it intersects with things like agile and product management and business architecture and all those fields that are colliding now, where we just need something that brings it all together. So I'm really, really passionate about that.
Wow, that's fantastic. Yeah, it sounds like we're on a very similar journey. I started out in tech support as well. I was working in a call center in a software company, and I would get, every time the phone rang, I had to answer it, and it was a constant stream of like, why would it work this way? This is not what the document said. And then I went from the tech support department into the development department. And I saw it from the other side. Well, this is what we intended to do. And so I could see from both sides, kind of like what you're describing, like some stuff translates and some stuff didn't translate so well. Yeah, interesting. So should we get into the book that you have written and the different book that you're now releasing as well?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, is it the topic basically? Is it flow essentially? How would you summarize sort of the theme and how this stuff breaks down? Because you mentioned a bunch of stuff, and I think it's all relative. Like to get high performance, high quality, high velocity, you need, I think, many of those things, right? All of them in some form or fashion in a modern organization. But how it all fits together is not obvious a lot of times. Like to find where the bottleneck is from a theory of constraints perspective. Like, how do you go about thinking about that, and how does the book address it?
Yeah, so the book, Flow Engineering, is really, and I co-wrote it with the wonderful Andrew Davis, who's written a book on Salesforce DevOps. So he's kind of interested in very, very similar things, and kind of approached me and asked the question, like, how do you suggest people learn about value stream mapping? Because a lot of people talk about it, but there's Karen Martins has a wonderful book, Value Stream Mapping, with Mike Osterling, and there's this slow uptake in the tech and the software world, because a lot of people will look at value streams, value stream management, flow, and think, okay, well, that's a manufacturing thing. We're not building widgets, identical widgets, so this doesn't apply to us. We're trying to be creative. We're trying to be innovative. We're doing different things every single iteration. And they kind of, I say they throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because there's an incredible amount of value in the lean world and the manufacturing world that we can learn from in software, specifically in the realm of kind of like reducing variation and trying to build more repeatable processes, because when you look at the software development lifecycle, or the process, the end-to-end delivery process, 99.8% is entirely repeatable and identical, right? And if you can get rid of the toil and the friction in those areas, then you have more time to be creative, right? You have more time to spend on innovation and experimentation. So I think it's just a monumental mistake to throw away everything that we've learned in manufacturing and in lean in the software world. And I think people are starting to realize that. We see huge pivot into flow from SAFe, and even the PMI and the folks who are classically in the project space are really leaning hard into this, because it's becoming impossible to ignore the benefits that you get. But the book is really meant to be a couple of things, to address a couple of things in organizations. One, visibility. Like, a lot of people need an ability to see the end-to-end flow of what's happening, because they just don't understand it, and it's impossible for them to come together to improve flow and get rid of friction, or minimize friction, mitigate handoff costs, and all these costs of coordination.
It's very kind of hard to manage
people.
something if you can't see it. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Exactly. I mean, it's hard to measure. You can't measure what you can't see. You can't manage what you can't measure. It's classic problems. And the other thing is, it's very hard to align with people, especially, across these cross-functional teams. How do you align with people if you can't look at the same picture and say, here's what stands out to me? That's interesting that is what you focus on. Can we both agree on this piece? What would you invest in if you had a magic wand? These things are all incredibly difficult if they're conversational, if they are just happening in a PowerPoint where someone's presenting their vision, and we have to kind of like align the hard way. Building a map together is an incredible way of building an alignment from scratch, like just natively aligning because you're essentially merging perspectives from the beginning. And then the other piece I think that's really valuable about these collaborative mapping practices that we talk about in the book is it's an easy on-ramp for anything that you want to do, right? Any initiative that you want to do, you have to set a clear target. You have to really align on what do we want? What is the outcome that we're trying to achieve? You have to look at what you're doing to establish kind of a current state baseline. You have to understand what is holding you back in that current state. And then you have to create like a future state and then make that future state actionable. And that's all that flow engineering is. When we talk about flow engineering, we're engineering flow by solving flow problems and engineering in kind of the broadest, most inclusive sense of just solving problems, right? It's not, I mean, there is a scientific aspect to it. There is a rigor aspect to it. There's empiricism involved, but this is not for engineers more so than anybody else. We really wanted it to also be a bridge to product management, project management, business architecture, infrastructure folks to kind of create a common visual language that they're a part of constructing so that people gain that alignment, gain that visibility, gain that on-ramp to what they're trying to do in a way that's a little bit more enjoyable and I think productive than I'm going to make a slide deck and present it in a meeting, or we're going to have endless whiteboard conversations, all the things
Yes.
that we kind of struggle with.
Can I ask you a potentially depressing and boring question? And then I want to open it up for Jeff and Mike. Tooling.
Sure.
Do you care? Do you have an opinion on what tool set? So let's say you're working with a bunch. So you got 10 teams, and their backlogs are all in Jira or Azure DevOps or whatever, and they need to deliver together. Like they need a vision, a map of what it looks like in 3 and 6, because they're. Let's say maybe they don't have a value stream in the sense that work comes in here and then it goes through these teams in the same predictable way most of the time. Maybe it's more like a value stream network where some stuff comes in and it goes over to these 3 teams, and some stuff comes here and it just goes to these 2 teams. And so it's a many to many. Do you care how they visualize across those teams? Does it matter what the tool set is? If you go down a certain road, is it easier or harder? Or is that really what this approach is designed to sort of abstract out? Like you can do this with any tool set?
Yeah, I mean, it's yes to all those questions. I do care. And it really is, flow engineering really is meant to abstract away from all the details that people get stuck in. So I do care in that I want it to be simple, very low friction from a production and consumption perspective. So that we minimize all the things that prevent people from doing this kind of work. Like for me, it's all about meeting people where they are. So I will use whatever tool they know how to use. If they don't know how to use Mural, but they spend all their time in PowerPoint, we're going to use PowerPoint. And we're just going to put boxes on a PowerPoint slide and move them around. Because that's the most important thing. The most important thing about flow engineering is that people are not doing it. They're not doing it in any form. And so it's the 0 to 1 that's the real challenge.
Yep.
The detail, the techniques, the tooling really doesn't matter nearly as much as just stepping away from the work to look at the work. And that's what I really advocate for. So we really designed it to be as accessible as possible so that it's almost impossible to say, oh, we don't have the time to do this, or that's too difficult, or we can't get buy-in. So everything is meant to be 90-minute workshops, something that you can really try to fit into any available time, and very easy to kind of sell from an ROI perspective, because by the time we get to current state value stream mapping, we've got an opportunity that represents 20% of the lead time that we can just, tomorrow, we can get rid of this thing. And that's like instant uplift. So we really focused on how do we make it impossible to say no to this? Because we know that people know about it. They know that these things exist. They're hearing about it all the time and they don't do it. So we just attack that. And we're trying to relentlessly burn down all the objections and make it as accessible as possible. So one of the most important things is use what you have today, carve out some time, maybe, just change the formula of your retro for one iteration and say, we're just going to map a value stream this week and see what happens. Right. So that's hopefully answers your question.
100%. It sounds like the best tool, it's kind of like exercise. The best tool
Right.
for value stream mapping is whatever you will use, right? Like whatever you will actually do, that is the best exercise for you to do. It's about getting over the 0 to 1 problem, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, you don't need to buy a Nordic track to get a workout. You can.
Right. Yeah, because if that's your excuse, it's not going to end with that, right? I mean, you're going to find another one.
Totally.
Yeah, Steve, that, and I think you sort of addressed it. One of my questions was going to be the biggest hurdles that you've encountered with organizations adopting flow engineering, value stream mapping, the whole 9 yards, and how do you address those with your flow engineering?
I think the hardest piece is the fragmentation that's in organizations today, where a lot of software product development flow is still downstream from a very intensive and time-consuming planning and shaping process, right? I mean, there's a lot of initial investment where the clock doesn't seem to run. And it's like somebody wants something and it sits in a global backlog for months and months and months, and everyone is fine with that. But then the moment it gets handed to development, and it gets handed, right? It's not pulled. So it gets thrown to development or, placed on their lap or whatever, dropped on their head.
With a deadline.
And then the clock starts and it's like, this has to be done tomorrow.
Yeah.
And you see all this, all this chaos where it's like, okay, well, if you want it done tomorrow, you're going to have to give me more than one line of requirements. And, this sense of urgency that you feel, I just heard about this today. So and I have questions, right? There's all kinds of stuff that gets ignored in, what a lot of people call the fuzzy front end, right? This initial planning and shaping. And those folks tend to be higher up in the organization, more on the business side, a little bit harder to bring into the tent to undertake something like this, right? To undertake this end-to-end visibility exercise and measurement exercise. And maybe rightly so, because what happens when you look at these flows from end to end is often 80% of the lead time is outside of the software product development flow. And then you got to go knocking on those doors and say, well, hey, are you folks interested in actually improving this? Because if you want customers to get what they want faster, you're going to have to look upstream. And I would say 99% of the time, you got to look upstream. It's either delay or it's lack of clarity, it's lack of inclusion of, key components or capabilities like security, compliance. So that's a major, major hurdle. And so I spend a lot of time trying to empower folks to reach upstream in a way that is motivating, inclusive, invitational, and mutually beneficial, right? Because there's a lot of benefit to those upstream flows of work. You just got to get over the pain of this is a big problem that has been ignored for a long time. So the facilitation aspect of it is very important because it's always a sensitive issue, right? There's
Yeah, and
very few people who kind of see themselves as separate from the system of work, right?
Right.
There's a lot of identity gets tied up in ownership, accountability, identity.
yeah, that resistance upstream seems to be, they're not unaware of the fact that they need to give good this definition or instruction to development, I think. And so they tend to have built a very ornate process around the inception of work, right? Where they have a stage gated model they go through where they take an idea and they think hard on it and they give it to, they involve architects, they involve all these other people who are anyone except development.
Right.
And they get them to weigh in, and by the time they produce their well imagined instruction, it's presented as a, you know, this is the commandments, go forth and execute on this. And it seems like you need to break that or break into that in some way, because it's by the time they've produced it, they've invested so much of their own valuable time
It's a lot
as
of
leaders
sunk
in those
costs,
organizations, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for you to come in and say, well, perhaps we could have imagined a different way of doing this, they're like, it's too late. We've already done it. That's that.
Right.
You know, we're not ready to have this conversation again for 6 months, 12 months, whatever. So have you encountered?
It's not irrational either, right? Because it's like, of course, they don't want to pull development staff or tech leadership out of delivery, right? Out of production to go ask them a bunch of questions where, you know, they're like, well, sure, you know, you want me to give you estimates? Great. Everybody hates that, right? I mean, it's very, it's negative value, right? It's almost entirely wasteful. It's frustrating. It's stressful. And it pulls you out of the present to go think about the future. And, you know, this very nebulous early stage rendition of the future that often doesn't have a vision or a roadmap to support it in terms of context and in terms of priority. So it's very difficult to make judgments or estimations about priority or dependency, like all these things that are hugely consequential. You know, what would be best for the engineers is just to get started working on it, right? Is to just say, let's agree on enough to set direction and what good looks like. And ideally, that's vision and roadmap that are notoriously neglected, right? Seriously absent at almost all times. And so you're just lacking the tools to do that well. And so in the absence of that, it's like, okay, well, let's not bother the engineers. Let's try to get this perfect and then hand it to them, you know, as nicely as possible, maybe, but it's still working against you, right? I mean, there's no amount of activity or rigor or process that you could actually follow if that's your way of thinking about this.
Right. Do you encounter organizations actually? We mentioned value a lot. We talk about value streams. We talk about prioritization. Do you find organizations are struggling with assigning value to the work they're trying to create or drive? Like, you know.
Yeah.
So how are
Absolutely.
you seeing
Yeah.
folks address that?
It's a major challenge. There's a couple of big rocks that I think are present in current product development process. One is estimation, like just the idea that we think we can do a better job through estimation than we can do by collecting data, making probabilistic analysis, right? I mean, that's a huge problem, and it's a huge source of waste and stress. It's like net negative, right? It's this big fallacy that ends up costing and has no tangible benefit to anybody. The other thing is this idea that we hesitate for the same reason, I think, that we're not beings that operate by a probability, right? I mean, we may, let's say, unconsciously, subconsciously make probabilistic judgments, but we're never conscious of it, right? I mean, there's very few people, I think, who would naturally think in terms of probability.
It's not intuitive to people, you mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and we're very much trained to think in terms of estimations and to think in terms of projects by our education system and all kinds of things. So we we think in terms of like large batches, uh, you know, very kind of Gantt focused operation, managing dependencies instead of mitigating dependencies. There's a lot of stuff that I think builds in this challenge around probability. And the reason that I'm saying that is that I think that all prevents us from making bets and effectively making value judgments about saying that I think that if we do this, it will have this result. And that result could be quantifiable, but it may just be qualifiable. And it may just be saying that we think that this metric will go up. There's so many challenging dependencies in the way of doing that because it means we have to have the data about that. We have to have chosen our most important critical metrics, which is a humongous hurdle that most organizations have not done. There's very few. There are extremely high performing organizations that have something like a North Star metric, which can be problematic as well, right? I mean, we have startups that kind of pursue a metric and it, to the detriment of everything else. But that can be very effective. It's at least clear, from a value perspective. And those organizations that choose that North Star metric and then say, I'm going to increase that by 3% by doing this activity, change, delivery. That I think gets you much, much closer to value than most organizations are today. And I think that we have real trouble with making a case for value in the absence of all that data, in the absence of the rigor, in the absence of the foundation for saying, I believe that if we do X, we will drive or enable result Y.
Yeah.
Yeah. I should give these guys a chance because I just was going to throw another follow-up on there.
No worries. Go for it.
All right. Then my question next is there a similarity between the drive to ask the business side or to ascribe value to something that we're creating? Is it just as difficult for them to ascribe value as it is for development to describe estimation? Like development is trying to come up with an estimate of how long it's going to take this ill-formed idea.
Mm-hmm.
And the business is struggling would struggle just as hard to ascribe what the benefit would be of doing that work. And it's almost like the business is just going, well, we don't need to think about that because we can just blame it all on the estimate that didn't happen.
Well, I think you're right. I think that one of the things that is a major impact on that set of challenges is the fact that engineering is actually a rare skill set, right? I mean, this idea that we're going to empirically approach problems from a curiosity perspective, from a discovery perspective, and, you know, have that driven by a hypothesis or a problem rather than a solution that we want to implement. Because we like to jump right to, oh, I want to see that, I want to see that thing. I want to see that capability realized or delivered. We very often jump right to solution, right? And that, and then we kind of try to, however, artificially like disprove that that'll work, or we'll often just try to make it work no matter what. But I think that makes it very, very difficult to understand what appropriate trade-offs are available to us and what the cost of each compromise is. We're trying to do X. We have a choice between Avenue A, Avenue B. They both have pros and cons. How do you make that choice if you have no real clarity around value or the target outcome? That all becomes very challenging, and I think very, very mentally taxing, and not just while we're making the decision. I think after we make the decision, it haunts us, right? After we make that compromise, we sit, as engineers, it sits in the back of our minds. Did we go down the wrong road with this? Is this just a waste of time? Am I gonna just have to end up rolling this back and going down Avenue A anyways? And that tax on our mental, let's say, bandwidth or whatever we want to call it, is considerable. I mean, maybe not for a lot of people, but I was constantly haunted by engineering decisions, especially at the CTO level. You're talking about one-way doors for the next 5 years. When you don't have a really clear understanding of what is the value that we're trying to deliver and what's the problem that we're trying to solve, then it's very difficult to say, okay, well, it's actually going to be very time intensive and a huge investment that may have downstream consequences or regressive consequences elsewhere. And it's very difficult to say, okay, well, we could just get that outcome by doing something very low tech, very simple, very easy, or we could just sidestep this problem altogether if we rethink the problem space or the opportunity. So that's the sort of thing that I think is, I mean, that's like the 10x opportunity, the huge breakthroughs and innovations are when we're allowed to kind of sit with the problem space, have the context, and think, what if we just sidestep this entirely? That gets really exciting. And you never get there if you're just taking orders or getting handed work. You will never have that opportunity.
I tend to think that even the reticence to go back and review, did we deliver value? And I don't mean at the team level or the development level. I mean at the upstream level. There is a reticence to go back and see, hey, this product that we developed, what kind of value did we get out of it? It's, hey, we put it out there in the world and we got what we got. And how will you ever learn? But I think there's a conscious reticence to even look at that, because the fear is that, oh, we probably didn't get the value that we had proposed we were going to get. And I sold this $50 million project as being, it's going to give us X number of, X amount of ROI. And, I know in my gut it fell short. Let's just not look at it. But we never learn that way.
Yeah, if we don't look at it, no one will call us out on it.
Right.
So let's just we shipped and it's full of bugs, so blame engineering. So it's all their fault.
Yeah. If you never make the bet, you never made the wrong bet.
If you don't look at it, maybe it's not there.
That's right. The Schrodinger's bet. Yeah.
The problem with this approach is that reality is oftentimes not willing to play along with the game. It's like what you're describing kind of speak in my mind. I translate it as like taking responsibility for the outcomes and discernment, because all of this stuff is sort of related. Measurement is important, but measurement immediately starts to set up incentives. And if you're not super careful with it, there's you might have heard this old story about there was a place, I think it was somewhere in India, that was struggling with poisonous snakes.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And so they're like, whoa, get rid of the poisonous snakes. How do we do that? Well, let's just have people kill them and bring them to us, and we'll pay them for those. And clearly the intent was to get rid of all the snakes, but the people were incentivized to breed snakes. And so they ended up with more snakes, right? And so at some point, somebody had to be like, guys, the outcome does not match our intention. To your point, this is not where we intended to end up, and it's not what we thought this was gonna produce. So yeah, that's a hard thing as a leader to say. I'm going to step back and say, it feels like the more senior you go in the organization, the more it's about sense making, right? Does this make sense? And is the course that we're on, does it make sense? Are we actually good shepherds for the whatever level you're responsible for? Is the span of my control, is everything going in the right direction? And if not, am I willing to own that? Because this stuff is not obvious. The question that I had is, you were talking about the overall system, and how one of the things you said earlier was a lot of the time that is spent in the delivery process is upstream of development, stuff that you might not see if you were just looking at value stream mapping for the development part of it. Does that imply, and this is related to what I just said, does that imply, or does that mean that your recommendation is to put a measurement in place relatively early on, so that as you make interventions, you can see if it's working or not? Or at what point do you start to instrument systems, and so you can see? Because if you just get in there and start making upgrades, maybe it works, but you can't demonstrate it, right? Which is also not great. So how do you think about that?
But it's really an interesting question that you have to grapple with very early, where you set the boundaries of scope for measurement. Because I'm what you might say kind of a lead time purist, where the moment that something hits the backlog, I would start the clock. Because and the backlog, I think, is whatever is the first place that an idea or a deliverable or a need arises, because the clock is running for somebody, right? The clock is running for senior leadership in the business. It's running for a customer who wants something. And oftentimes organizations will ignore that because it hasn't been vetted, right? I mean, this thing might be just a wild shower idea or something that someone dreamed up in the middle of the night. But I don't think that's an excuse. I don't think it's a valid excuse. I think that that's just a missing intake process where you filter out the potential from the not today, throw it away, let it come back when it's more defined, or when we hear about it 5 more times, right? There's a million ways to do upstream filtering of intake very easily, automatically, right? I mean, there's countless ways to filter your intake to make sure that anything that hits and starts the clock, it's important for us to get that out as quickly as possible. And I think that really makes a humongous difference in real measurement. The measurement that matters is the measurement ultimately of the person who's going to pay you. That's what a business is for. A business is for customer satisfaction. And, there's a lot of different nuances to that. There's market dominance. There's uncovering new value and exploration and innovation. But the same principles apply. You need to be able to deliver quickly, to learn quickly. And that's all there is. So there's folks that start their measurement at when development starts, or when development accepts something, or when it's handed to development. And that's going to obscure and hide this upstream that someone is waiting for. The clock is running. And so, like, this idea that the clock is always running, I think is fundamental to lean. I think it's fundamental to customer satisfaction value. A lot of value that I think we forget about is timeliness, right? I mean, a bottle of water at the right time is 10 times more valuable than the wrong time.
Yeah.
It's environmental as much as it is, linked to the right time. And there's all kinds of factors that influence value. And so I think that this idea of truly starting to measure lead time is the first thing. And to your question, it's the good news is it's the easiest thing to measure. You know when everything starts. You actually know there's something that gets created in a system, doesn't go away when the thing gets completed. We have all this data, and it's really just a start, stop, time elapsement, right? So that's the first step. The first step is just accepting that lead time is something that is consequential, is important to measure, and that we can measure it. And it doesn't take us buying a tool or even creating a dashboard. You can do it in it's built into a lot of tools, but you can actually query any tool that you have and figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. In my experience, the challenge for that is to get aligned with everybody to say, what are the boundaries on this? Like, what does started mean? What does completed mean? And then who's going to own the process of aggregating that data and reflecting it back to everyone so that we can actually use it to make decisions and guide the process. But it's not, yeah, I agree. It's easy to get fuzzy and be like, I don't know.
The hardest part, to your point, the hardest part is deciding that you will act on that data.
Yep.
That is a challenge. That is a real challenge because it involves a lot of responsibility, accountability, and a commitment.
Wouldn't you also have to be careful about how you act on that data? Because I can see a situation where you're being militant about measuring lead time, and eventually there's a couple ways to look at backlogs, and one is you just put any idea you come up with in the backlog, and then you'll vet it and decide if you'll do that. If somebody, though, starts measuring lead time, and from the time an idea is put into the backlog until it actually sees the light of day, if it ever sees the light of day, that thing is accumulating elapsed time.
Mm-hmm.
Might someone not look at that and say, well, there's some harebrained idea in there that has been accumulating time and it's throwing off our measurement. It's throwing off our metrics. Our lead times look terrible. Like, how do you protect against that?
Yeah, I think that that is another reason why, or brings me back to the reasons why that initial vetting is really important. Like, I think it's really important to very quickly make that judgment of this sits in this backlog, maybe it moves to another backlog. Maybe it moves to an ice box where this is good ideas that we don't know if it's the right time for. We don't know if we know enough. We're putting it in. We're putting it in the known or unknown unknowns. That can happen very quickly, I think, provided you have all that supporting information around. This is the vision, this is the roadmap, this is what good looks like, this is the direction we're heading, these are the types of things that we say yes to, these are our customers who we understand from a persona perspective, from what has made them happy in the past. I think there's a lot of criteria that can very quickly allow you to do that. Not today, or let it sit. I mean, to your another aspect that I thought you were going to go into was, what if you're optimizing for lead time to the detriment of quality or satisfaction?
Yeah.
And that's very, very fair criticism. I think, any time that you have any measure in isolation, you get the snake problem, right? So what you want is a portfolio of measurements. And I think that there's always priority in these measurements, and it could shift depending on the needs of the organization. It could be that we're going to take our time building everything for the next 6 months because we're just getting too many support requests. We're pissing people off. Um, that's very important to be clear about what are we optimizing for, and what does that mean that we measure, and what are the guardrails on that measurement, right? What are the checks and balances that will make sure that we don't pull too far in one direction or over optimize to the detriment of something else? So I think uh, I suggest people start measuring lead time yesterday, but I would say that you also have to be measuring everything else that good is made of, and change that, over time, re-examine it, make sure that that measure is still serving you.
Yeah. This is what it means to do real systems thinking in my head. It's like looking at the whole thing. There's a whole sort of topic of systems thinking. It's like it's not any part of this, it's how everything fits together and functions. And it's almost like you got to think through, okay, how could this whole system fail? Like, what are the different failure modes for this? Like, it could be too slow, so you measure lead time. It could be really fast, but have crappy quality, so you got to measure defects. And it could be like optimized in locally, and but not like you could do a bunch of work and never actually generate more money or cut any costs or like satisfy the reason for the whole system to exist in the first place. So it's like it's almost like a high level exercise to think about, well, why would this, let's assume it doesn't exist. Would you build it? Right? And why would you build it? And what would you build it for? And how would you get objective measures on all those sort of dimensions, I guess? Would that be a way to think? Is that sort of how you think about it when dealing with clients?
Yeah, I like all this, and it exists in a much broader context. And there's one of the things about systems thinking is you also have to draw a boundary around the system in order to grapple with it effectively, right? I mean, you can't be considering the effect of the changing season on your infrastructure because it just doesn't serve you to get to a level of granularity or a level of scope that paralyzes you from a analysis perspective, right? So you have to be very clear, and this is where, again, upstream vision, roadmap, uh, you know, all the things that guide your decision making also help you manage scope. And because there's diminishing returns, right? There's very rapidly diminishing returns. You expand your scope, and all of a sudden you're considering details that don't have a meaningful impact on what you're trying to do. So I think that one of the things that folks kind of fall into when they start systems thinking is like, oh, everything's connected and there's complexity everywhere and we can't truly know anything for sure. And that's a very
a trap.
paralyzing place to, yeah, that's a trap. So
Yeah.
it's very important, I think, to be very clear about, I'm going to ignore all this stuff in service of this. And that's one of the fundamental pieces of flow engineering that I found really, really important. And I learned after I started value stream mapping for a while, is that we would just start mapping. It would be very difficult to understand what to map, what not to map, and what level of detail to map at. And we had to start with an initial assessment of what are we really trying to achieve? What's the future that we want to create? And then look at the value stream, because without that, it was very difficult to draw those boundaries on the system and say, this is the right stream, this is the right resolution, this is the right level of scope, or, are we going high level with this? Are we going low level with this? And so kind of try to do both in flow engineering and say, what's the high level flow that serves this target outcome? And then where we see the constraint and where we see different bottlenecks, we'll dig in and get to a level of detail that serves that purpose of, understanding the constraint. But all of it is meant to be very lean, and it's informed by value, right? Like we go, we sort of talk in the order of value, clarity, flow in that order, because without a sense of value, without a sense of that initial direction, it's very difficult to get clarity, because clarity on what? What does clarity mean? Does it mean high level? Does it mean extreme detail in a specific area? You don't know until you have at least a definition of value. And that definition of value is constraining from a governing perspective, but an enabling perspective as well. It allows you to say no to a bunch of things that you could analyze, and allows you to properly set your level of resolution or detail or zoom to something that's going to get you most of the benefit for the least effort.
Yeah, makes total sense. So we're coming up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just really briefly, and Steve, you kind of touched on this here, but so when you're having conversations, you're brought into an organization, you're speaking with management, executive management, or middle management. What is the problem in their eyes that flow engineering solves?
Mm.
In their eyes and in their language, what are they trying to solve that says, oh man, I think Steve's got the answer?
It's a great question. I was going to ask a similar question. Like, what do you wish people could know going in that they discover in the process?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay, let me hit first the why do people come to flow engineering? And it's much broader than I expected. And what I used it for personally when I started out, it was, we have a lot to do and it takes too long to do anything. And so it really was kind of a throughput focus, trying to get more done in less time with less effort, and maximize our return on investment for the talent that we had, the resources we had, the information that we had. And so it was primarily around throughput, and a lot of people come to flow engineering for, we need to get more done. We're just, the business isn't happy with product development or engineering, or we have this cumbersome or painful process, and we need to streamline it because maybe we need to cut costs. Like all these things are kind of interconnected, but some people come from different perspectives. We need to cut costs. We need to get more because we were counting on hiring and we can't hire now. So how do we reach the next level of scale that we need to hit without investing more in growing our talent pool? But there's also folks who come for quality reasons. So there's too many escape defects in production. So we have to look at how they get produced. What can we do to mitigate or avoid, build quality in? So there's a visibility challenge there, but there's also, a measurement of what are we actually doing in this process that's allowing bugs to get out, or whatever it is that's impacting quality. And then sometimes it's incident resolution. When we find an issue, it takes us too long to resolve it. So that's, again, it's kind of on the other side of that quality equation. How do we recover as fast as possible? And then there are increasingly folks who are coming to flow engineering thinking about, we have a siloed organization, we have maybe a little mix of kind of waterfall and scrum, and we want to move towards flow. We want to, kind of have a smoother operation, and that's what they're coming to address. So I hope that answers your question. It's not specific. It's a lot of different things, but it's it's really interesting to hear what people are getting, finding success with. And there's a lot of people doing flow engineering now beyond me, which is one of the benefits of putting the book out. And I hear about folks using it for all kinds of stuff. things like sales processes and marketing flows, creating campaigns, etc.
Is the recognition in the market, is flow a recognized term in the market? The way agile became a recognized term in the market? Because if an organization hasn't heard about flow yet, how do you get their attention to come to the table for this?
I think that it has a major advantage in terms of language because I think everybody intuitively understands flow, right? To an extent that we don't really natively understand lean or agile, right? You kind of have to be instructed on what those actually mean, and that it's very, it means different things to different people. We went through the same problem with DevOps, right? It's gonna happen forever.
I'm sure
Some of these terms
sure
are
what
just
that means.
never going to be intuitive
yeah.
to people, right?
Whereas flow evokes an image in your mind about something moving from one point to another, a steady stream, a continuous. I keep trying to not use the word flow.
Right.
It's hard
It's
to-
the opposite of
Continuous
stuck,
progression
right?
Of,
Yeah.
of delivery, of movement, of change. And I think that's a major advantage. And I think that a lot of folks are really seizing on that realization that we've come up with jargon in the past, or we've come up with fantastic labels for things or names for things. But unless people, most people who hear it for the first time understand what you mean when you say it, and you're saying it for the 1,000th time, you have a problem. You have a major problem. And
Yeah.
I don't think, the biggest problem with flow is, are you talking about individual flow? Are you talking about a flow state? Or are you talking about collective flow? And a lot of folks, are thinking, okay, you say flow and you're doing work, so we're talking about individual flow here. But it doesn't actually trigger any alarm bells, or it's not uncomfortable to go then think about, okay, well, what does that mean for larger scale? What does that mean for a group of people to be in a state of flow or to be in a workflow, a flow of work? So I think that is a superpower. And I think that the market is understanding that this is something they don't have to explain, that they don't have to correct people's understanding of to communicate effectively. And that to me makes all the difference. It's a big reason why we went, with the book title, but I've been using, the term flow engineering for a very long time. One, to capitalize on flow as a word that a lot of people understand. And a lot of people understand engineering now in a broader sense of like a problem solving sense. My audience is technical folks. Primary audience is technical folks. So engineering to them, they understand it. Some of them might think, oh, that's a little rigorous for my taste, or, that's not a comfort zone for me. But I think that's also increasingly kind of intuitive that engineering is. We're solving problems. We're using a process to do that. And so I hope that part doesn't turn folks off or make them think twice about maybe this is not for me.
Yeah, to me it seems like subconsciously, intuitively, especially if you're talking to somebody whose day-to-day experience is they're stuck or stuff isn't moving or they're having trouble getting stuff moving. Like flow, I think you're right. It just sort of inherently strikes the right note, right? It aligns people instantly is the sense that I get. Anyway, we've reached the end of our time box. We've flowed to the end. This has this felt like an
hit
agile
the
thing.
dam.
We've hit the dam of the flow. So, Steve, thanks for coming. My name's Matt Beam.
Nyam, nyam, nyam.
I'm not flowing super well. Go ahead.
Your name's Matt Beam.
My name's Matt Beam.
I'm Mike Markey.
I'm Jeff Singleton.
I've been Steve Periera.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Please come back soon and we'll talk more about flow.
Great
I
to
love
talk
that.
to you, Steve.
Thanks for having me.